25 days since the Israel-Hamas war began, thousands have been killed, injured, and displaced. Israel's subsequent strike against the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip have FBI Director Christopher Wray issuing a warning about lone wolf-style assailants targeting Western nations.
Discussions about the most pressing national security threats that what we face and what we're doing to tackle them are always important, but it seems especially well-timed this year with the dangerous implications the very fluid situation in the Middle East has for our homeland security. The reality is that the terrorism threat has been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level. Since the horrific terrorist attacks committed by Hamas against innocent people in Israel a few weeks ago, we've been working around the clock to support our partners there and to protect Americans here at home. We assess that the actions of Hamas and its allies will serve as an inspiration, the likes of which we haven't seen since ISIS launched its so-called caliphate several years ago. In just the past few weeks, multiple foreign terrorist organizations have called for attacks against Americans and the West. Al-Qaeda issued its most specific call to attack the United States in the last 5 years. ISIS urged its followers to target Jewish communities in the United States and Europe. Hezbollah has publicly expressed its support for Hamas and threatened to attack U.S. interests in the Middle East. And we've seen an increase in attacks on U.S. military bases overseas carried out by militia groups backed by Iran. Here in the United States, our most immediate concern is that violent extremists, individuals or small groups, will draw inspiration from the events in the Middle East to carry out attacks against Americans going about their daily lives. That includes not just homegrown violent extremists inspired by a foreign terrorist organization, but also domestic violent extremists targeting Jewish or Muslim communities. We've already seen that with the individual we arrested last week in Houston, who'd been studying how to build bombs and posted online about his support for killing Jews. And with the tragic killing of a 6-year-old Muslim boy in Illinois in what we're investigating as a federal hate crime. But as I said a few moments ago, on top of the homegrown violent extremists and domestic violent extremist threat, we also cannot and do not discount the possibility that Hamas or another foreign terrorist organization may exploit the current conflict to conduct attacks here on our own soil.
Award-winning journalist Rula Jebreal believes Israel's war could turn into another U.S. war in the Middle East. She joins us now from New York. Rula, glad to have you. We were already seeing Yemen get involved now, and then we're seeing other countries refusing Palestinian refugees. Your assessment as we sit now, almost a month after this started?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, what we learned from the war on terror, 20 years war on terror that America led, where the United States spent $8 trillion, I believe, thousands of Americans perished, 600 Iraqis. Again, we see the Taliban back in power. They are in charge of Afghanistan. And we see that the result of that failed war, that Iran controls Iraq. Today, the Iranians basically declared war on the United States through their proxies in Yemen, who have missiles, cruise missiles, who have drones, and can attack the United States at any moment. But also we learn that you cannot kill your way to defeating an ideology. You can actually defeat the ideology if you address the underlying crisis that feeds it. Killing thousands of civilians, children, indiscriminate bombing, like Israel is doing, actually strengthening that ideology. And we've seen this over and again. Every time the United States bombed a country or a city, remember Fallujah, remember Mosul, or the images of Abu Ghraib, we've seen a peak of radicalization because they feed on desperation. And I think it's made very clear by people who led the war on terror, General Petraeus and others, that the only strategy to weaken, defeat the ideology is by ending the military occupation, ending the segregation and discrimination of the Sunni in Iraq or elsewhere, and even the Israeli generals and people in charge of the security apparatus, like Ami Ayalon, who was in charge of the Israel, who's Chris Wray of America, in charge of the FBI of the Israel. He said, without a Palestinian state, absent a Palestinian state, we will be in forever wars. That is the driver, the main driver behind the violence.
What do you say when critics, those who oppose your position, when they say, well, if Hamas does not orchestrate this attack on October 7th, none of this is happening?
Well, that's, I'm not sure I can say this word, but clearly they don't understand what they're talking about, and that's BS. Why? Because the war, we've been in a conflict, Israel-Palestine, for 70 years. There's been a military occupation of the Palestinian people in East Jerusalem, in West Bank, and in Gaza for the last 57 years. Gaza itself has been blockaded completely and considered under occupation still by the Israelis for the last 16 years. We had 5 wars. I mean, either they're, I don't know if they were sleeping or dreaming or having cocktail, but this is a reality that we have on the ground. And for 56 years, 7 years almost, Israelis decided and told the world that the only way they could feel safe if Palestinians are on their knees, are under military occupation, behind walls, in cages, without any rights, human rights, civil rights, political rights whatsoever, systematically oppressed and violated in every level of their life. I mean, the level, while we're talking about Gaza, rightly so, if you look at the occupied territory of, the West Bank, where Hamas doesn't exist, in the last week only, 120 Palestinians were killed. We've seen, pictures and videos of Abu Ghraib-style torture made by very fanatical, radical settlers who come from New Zealand and Australia and the United States and Brooklyn, and they feel more entitled to the land, and they want to steal the land and depopulate the population because they have an agenda with God. They think that God told them this is their land, and they need to take it. So we're focusing on the fanaticism and the terrorism that Hamas is, engaged in, but we're also neglecting the fanaticism, the ethno-religious project of exclusion and purity led by those in the West Bank, and they elected their government. I mean, the far-right government of Bibi Netanyahu have a terrorist, a convicted terrorist that is Ben Gvir, who his whole agenda is to ethnically erase Palestinians. They even call for a second Nakba, which is the extermination of Palestinians, in parliament. We're not dealing with normal people. We're dealing with a far-right extremist government that believe that God told them the entirety of the land should be theirs and there should be no Palestinians.
You're Palestinian. You were born in Israel. You've seen this up close and personal. We are seeing significant protest around the country. I had Malcolm Nance on the show yesterday, and he was questioned about this notion that some people suggested, well, if you are protesting for the Palestinians, that you are anti-Semitic. And you hear this. You hear this where people are like, well, if you're on the Palestinian side, you're on the side of Hamas, as opposed to being on the side of the Palestinian people. Then you have folks out here. There's a number of people who are Jewish who've been protesting, who say Netanyahu has to go. You see President Biden, his position that he's taken to stand with Israel is costing him significantly among Arab Americans, especially young folks as well. And so, looking at all of this, what does a person say? What does a person do? Because I know a lot of people who are like, man, you know what? I don't want to say anything because, hell, I'm afraid of getting fired and losing my job, depending upon what I say.
So I just want to emphasize that African Americans were considered subhuman, and a lot of people went to the streets and were killed for advocating for their equal rights, for their right to live as free men and women, treated equally with dignity in this society. Palestinians, millions of us who are, whether Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza and elsewhere, and that's an overwhelming majority, that's what we want: freedom, end of the occupation, dignity, not charity. We would like to live like you and like your children and like many Americans, as not under the boot of a military dictatorship. We've been trying to forge a future for our children. I lived all my life under military occupation. I was raised in an orphanage. The orphanage was established in 1948 by a woman who collected children who were the survivor of a massacre at Deir Yassin. The oldest one was 8 years old. The youngest one was 1 year old. They always told me that how their homes were blown up, how their families were butchered and tortured and massacred, how their lands were stolen, how they became refugees in their own land, traumatized, terrorized. So when I look at their aspiration to live in a world that is free of fear, of hatred, of racism, is that not legitimate? Is that not legitimate? And we need to be very clear about real anti-Semitism, and I believe Donald Trump is anti-Semitic, but he's pro-Bibi. When he says that American Jews, are disloyal to Israel, that's anti-Semitism. When he invited Nick Fuentes and these real anti-Semites, that's anti-Semitism. It's the hatred of Jews because they are Jews. But to criticize Israel policies, that is not anti-Semitism. To criticize Zionism, which is the ideology of the government, that's not anti-Semitism. As you know, there's a lot of interracial, interreligious marriages. There's a lot of people like Sarah Bashi and others who are married to Palestinians. They are Jews. The main issue is an issue of justice, is an issue of rights and self-determination and end of the subjugation. It's not an issue of religion. And Bibi yesterday, Netanyahu tried to put religion in the midst, and he talked about the Bible, with the Bible. When your agenda is with God, then you cannot question, the policies. That is a very dangerous promise when it becomes about a holy war between him and Iran. This legitimizes actually the extremists, which their narrative is this is a holy war. It's not a holy war. It's very simple. Do we all, as human beings in the 21st century, deserve to be free, deserve equal rights, or we deserve, as brown, black Palestinians, people from the global south, do we deserve, equal rights? But not only that, do we deserve international law and the protection under international law, or Israel is above the law? These are the questions that are being asked. And I think America has to decide, are we for, against military occupation when Russia does it, but we are for military occupation when Israel does it? Are we, as Americans, the United States, do you stand for freedom for Ukrainians, but not for Palestinians? These are the heart of the issues when it comes to double standards, and which undermine the whole promise of Joe Biden and his administration of rule-based international order. I mean, today I received a text message from a professor of international affairs, one of the best in the Middle East. He tweeted saying, I apologize to my student. I taught them international law. Clearly, America and Europe and the UK doesn't think it applies to us, because in their eyes, we're still under colonial rule. We're still the subject, the subhuman, the animal. And it made me cry and weep, because you're losing a generation of people who believe in America's ideals and what America offers: freedom, democracy, dignity, opportunity.
We're talking with award-winning journalist Rula Jebreal about what's happening with this Israel-Gaza war. Let's start with my panel. First off, Mustafa Santiago Ali, your question for Rula.
Yeah, well, Sister Jabril, thank you for being here with us. I don't think that folks actually understand the significance of how much death and carnage is happening. You had mentioned before about both the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. We had 7,000 soldiers who lost their lives over about 18-year time period. And now we've had about 8,000 folks, who have lost their lives in Gaza. We, of course, have the 1,400 that were there in Israel. Can you really help people to understand? And then, of course, all the babies and children who have lost their lives. Can you help folks to really understand what's actually happening on the ground? Because they turn on, news shows and they really probably don't get a flavor.
So before the war, 90% of Palestinians didn't have in Gaza, and in Gaza there's 2.2 million Palestinians who live there. 90% didn't have access to water before the war. Before the war, 50% of them were under poverty line, didn't have access to proper food. With this war, they are now starving, dying of starvation. I get text message of people telling me that they don't know what to feed their children, that they have to decide whether to kill the cat or not. This is the human condition today in Gaza. Children are consuming water unfit for human consumption, contaminated water. People in the hospitals, the Shifa hospital that Netanyahu threatened to bomb because he conveyed that there's some kind of tunnels underneath it. And by the way, the UNRWA, the agency, refugee agency, and a lot of doctors who worked there for 16 years, international doctors, said they never seen any proof of that this is not the first time that Israel made that claim. This is the 8th time that made that claim. And again, in that hospital, they don't have any more anesthesia. They're amputating people without anesthesia. Women are giving birth, cesarean operations without anesthesia. This is the incredible condition, and every hospital and every healthcare facility is collapsing. We are watching a humanitarian catastrophe of which we never seen anything like this in the history of Israel-Palestine and in the history of the Middle East. I testified before the European Parliament about the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen in 2018, and that was a tragedy beyond, but it was a span of years. In the span of 3 weeks, Israel killed around 8,000 Palestinians, of which 3,500 children, and then we have around 2,000 bodies under the rubble that nobody can recover because they're being shelled and carpet bombed continuously. We've seen that today they attacked the refugee camp, a refugee camp. Let me reiterate that, a refugee camp. The Jabalia refugee camp bombarded that, dropped a one-ton bomb. They dropped, by the way, 7,000 bombs and missiles, which is the same amount that America used in Afghanistan and Iraq combined in years, in a very small strip of land, heavily populated, and it's only 45 kilometers. And the mass atrocity that are being committed today, that we are witnessing in real time, is the direct product of decade-long Israel impunity provided by the UK, the US, and Europe, and for decade-long dehumanization of Palestinians in mainstream media, the exclusion of voices. I am so blessed and lucky to be here, but this is the only time my humanity is not questioned. This is the only time I don't have to defend our existence.
This is a protest that took place in London. We're seeing this all across the world, Rula. And what's also interesting is that you have the efforts trying to shut down Al Jazeera. Even the United States has said, hey, has gone to the Qatari government and saying, hey, can Al Jazeera pull back? You have some places that literally are banning pro-Palestinian protest.
Exactly, and the tragedy that, even though we have really, the media is very one-sided, as we know, except, small pockets, people don't believe them anymore. The overwhelming majority of the global South, the brown and black world, does not believe the lies They didn't believe it about the WMD in Iraq, and they don't believe it now. They don't believe that a nuclear state power, which is Israel, cannot do anything except murdering Palestinians. They cannot believe, they understand that it's about land, but also they understand the hypocrisy of the Western democracy when they blame Russia for committing crimes, and then when it comes to Israel, they look the other way and it's like, never mind, actually enable it and bankroll it. It was astonishing yesterday when I believe the State Department released a statement and a video saying we're helping Gaza. They send 40 trucks to Gaza. They need 500 a day. They sent 45 trucks and they were bragging about it. But you know what else they send? $14 billion in armament to Israel. So they are contributing and bombing Palestinians, but then they send some charity and little food to those who are being bombed. I mean, and people, that's why people are angry. Israelis themselves are in the streets. Our Jewish brother and sisters are all over the world in the streets saying enough is enough. We need a political solution. They're even telling us, the survivor, our dead babies that were butchered by Hamas, which is a real atrocity and a war crime, cannot be answered with more atrocities and war crimes. That will not bring back our babies. These are survivors. Their voices are important to listen to. People who negotiated with Hamas on behalf of the Israeli government, the current Israeli government, like Baskin, who was an advisor to the Israeli government of Bibi Netanyahu, are telling us that the prime minister enabled and strengthened Hamas by negotiating with them, giving them money. There's a direct quote from Bibi Netanyahu himself who said, anybody that wants to thwart a Palestinian state need to support Hamas, finance Hamas, because then we can use Hamas as a scarecrow and say, well, we don't have a partner. Hamas is an asset. Those are the words of the prime minister today, who released the leader of Hamas, who is the architect of the terrorist attack. In 2011, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, was released by Bibi Netanyahu under the order of Bibi Netanyahu in 2011. He didn't kill an Israeli then. He killed Palestinians. Now he led this attack, and this is the same guy that Bibi Netanyahu thought he was an asset.
Got about 3 minutes left. I got two questions. Let me go to Randy Bryant. Randy, go.
I just wanted to thank you for being here and speaking so eloquently and passionately to us about this. I wanted to ask you, what role do you think that social media has been playing? Because I feel as if before we always just trusted our government and our news sources to tell us the truth. But now we have so much information coming from individuals so now we're seeing the truth and able to make different decisions. So what is your opinion about the role it has played?
I think it's huge. It's huge. It's huge. Look, I look at the struggle of African Americans, and I'm inspired by what, people in South Africa and people who basically, led the civil rights movement in this country without social media. It took years, hundreds of years. Today, we have the news in zero time, and we don't trust the same people who sold us the lies about the Iraq War, who sold us many other lies, and we question their truth. So when Israel says we never bombed a hospital, well, let an international investigation decide, and then they tell you, oh, no, we don't want an international team to investigate. But then we remember they killed our colleague, Shireen Abu Akleh, last year. They lied about it, and then they confirmed it 6 months after. They bombed the headquarters of the UN in Lebanon, 1996, killing 110 people. They lied about it, and then guess what? The United Nations determined that Israel did it. So people don't trust governments anymore for good reasons.
Thank you.
Joy, go ahead.
Yeah. I hope everyone will watch this segment. I've learned a lot. I think many of us are still learning about this. Even those who know more history are still learning. What do you want from the American people? What do you want them to do? If you could speak to them right now, the American voter, what do you need them to do?
Please ask the government to stop the killing of children. Please pressure Joe Biden and Democrats to stop the murder and the slaughterhouse in Gaza. Gaza is an open-air prison. Now it's becoming a cemetery for children, a slaughterhouse, a carnage. Nobody will be safe. No Israeli will be saved if more Gazans and more civilians and more children die. President Biden might lose these elections because he can alienate Democrats, progressives, Latino and brown and black and Arabs and Muslims who look at his policy and they're the continuation of Trump policies. We need to wake up, especially the Democrats, and pressure people so this carnage can end and we can all be free. None of us is safe or free until we're all free.
Rula Jebreal, always appreciate you joining us here on Roland Unfiltered. Thanks a bunch.